I'm the executive director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture here at the University of Chicago. Research Bites is one of the programs that we initiated to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. We're so pleased today to be able to welcome Dr. Thomas Fisher to discuss his new book with colleagues from the medical campus. And the center is also pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion in the Biological Sciences Division. A quick thank you to our staff, Tiara Kilpatrick and Beth Iwano, for their work in making this program possible. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Tobias Spears, who's the Assistant Dean and the Director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion in the BSD.
Thank you so much, Tracy, Dr. Matthews. Before we get started, I wanted to just take a few moments to recognize that there's been so much happening in our country, particularly around anti-Black violence. And so just wanted to stop for a second and show the pictures of the folks who were killed in Buffalo, New York in the Top supermarket, and also read their names, just to acknowledge that this is not normal, and we need to say people's names because we don't need to let this become something that we just skirt around or not think twice about. So I'm going to share my screen and read the names of those people who were killed in the supermarket. Catherine Massey, who was 72. Hayward Patterson, who was 67. Pearl Young, who was 77. Celestine Cheney, who was 65. Andre McNeil, who was 53. Roberta Drury, who was 32. Ruth Whitfield, who was 86. Aaron Salter, who was 55. Margus Morrison, who was 52. And Geraldine Talley, who was 62. And so I start on a somber note, but I am really excited about having this conversation with Dr. Fisher, particularly because I think it's gonna shed light on, just what we've been experiencing with these last couple of years, whether that be racial trauma, whether that be a pandemic that's impacted the whole entire world. And I'm also excited about having Dr. Fisher in conversation with Dr. Heather Renfro, who is an emergency medicine physician, resident, and also Isaiah Selkridge, who is a Pritzker medical school student. And so without further ado, I'll introduce our three folks, and then we'll get started with the questions. So I will start with our medical student. Isaiah Selkridge is a rising third-year med student at the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine. Isaiah was born and raised in the Bronx, New York. I'm from Brooklyn, so I gotta, we love the BX. Isaiah identifies as an Afro-Caribbean and African-American male. Isaiah earned his BA in biology from the University of Pennsylvania in 2015. He then went on to work as a technical specialist at Apple and as a senior research coordinator at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai Tisch Cancer Institute. Isaiah has over 10 peer-reviewed publications. Isaiah served as the co-president of the Student National Medical Association, the nation's largest organization for underrepresented minorities in medicine, particularly Black folks. He also is the co-director of HPrep, a program run by medical students catered to high school students interested in healthcare as a career. In addition, Isaiah sat on the board for one of Pritzker's 5 free clinics and currently sits on the Community Initiatives Committee for the UChicago Grad Council. His career interests include orthopedic surgery, sports medicine, opening his own free clinics, a fashion podcast, and opening his own school. His research interests include addressing and reducing gun violence in underserved communities, mental health and mental health in the Black community, and sports medicine. So welcome, Isaiah. And as I read your bio, I just recognize the talent that we have here at the Pritzker School of Medicine. And just like, once you graduate, what you're gonna bring to healthcare is amazing. And now I will introduce Dr. Heather Renfro, who is currently a PGY2 in emergency medicine at the wonderful University of Chicago. She is the co-president of our House Staff Diversity Committee, which I have the pleasure of advising, and a resident doctor in emergency medicine. She enjoys creating spaces where like-minded individuals can have fellowship, be carefree, especially in today's climate. She is a member of the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine, where she is a national committee member of the Equity and Inclusion and Fellowship Approval Committees. Heather is also currently an at-large board member of AAEM/RSA. In her free time, she volunteers through the University of Chicago's MedSeep program and teaches sessions on emergency preparedness and stop the bleed training. She plans to obtain a fellowship in emergency medicine after residency, where she will continue emergency preparedness training and ultimately become a medical director of EMS. She is a vegan, a dancer, and a food enthusiast. Catch her on Yelp for her reviews of all your favorite restaurants. So welcome, Dr. Heather Renfro. And lastly, I will introduce our invited guest for today, Dr. Thomas Fisher, who is a board-certified emergency medicine physician from Chicago. He has worked to improve healthcare as an academic, health insurance executive, and White House fellow in the Obama administration. His path includes training as Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholar, being honored as a Crane Chicago Business 40 Under 40, and inclusion in the Aspen Institute's Health Innovators Fellowship. He is an epicure and a runner, and for the past 20 years, he has worked in the emergency department at the University of Chicago, serving the same Southside community where he was raised. Welcome, Dr. Fisher. So I will turn it over to you all, and I know we will start the first question with you, Heather, and I will step back.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And Dr. Fisher, what an amazing, amazing book you have written. Let's get into it. So my first question, kind of statement question for you. So when I first read the title, The Emergency, A Year of Healing and Heartbreak in a Chicago ER, just the title alone, I was thinking, okay, this is going to be a book about COVID, a book about COVID and U of C interface. But I quickly realized that this book was so much more than that. Can you please tell us what, throughout these last 2 years of reflecting on your career and everything that's gotten you to this point, what does the emergency mean to you?
So thank you for the introduction, Tobias. It is wonderful to be here with colleagues and friends. And I am really edified by being hosted by Dr. Renfro and the soon-to-be Dr. Selkridge. The future is bright for us in medicine. When I was in your position, I had the impression that so much of what I see wrong in the emergency department, amongst the early disease and injury of my patients and their challenges in finding definitive care, were simple misunderstandings that competent leadership and skilled engagement would allow for us to unravel in a timely fashion. And over the course of my career, I would see things quickly improve. And what I found was something a little bit different. What I found was a system that is functioning exactly as designed. Nothing is broken at all. And the challenges that are faced by my patients aren't faced by all patients. And even not all patients within the system that I deliver care in. I spent decades outside of academia working to think carefully about what are the optimal system solutions that would alleviate so much suffering and liberate many of our patients from the traps that they face. And I had successes and failures in that process. The book itself was an opportunity for me to step back and think carefully about what have I learned? Look, I finished residency, 20 years ago or so. And in that time, things are very similar to when I was in residency, right? And over the 20 years, we've seen the Affordable Care Act. We've seen novel drugs enter and then exit the marketplace. We've got whiz-bang new technologies that allowed for us to get vaccines into our arms within a year of a pandemic. And yet we still see our young men perforated full of holes and come to us bleeding. We still see young people with renal failure well before their time. We still see a waiting room full of people waiting 5, 10 hours to be served. The same challenges that I saw, when I was in both of your positions. And what I wanted to do in this book was at least 2 things, maybe 3 when I think about it. The first was to reveal the intimacy between strangers that happens in the emergency department, where in an unselected population, we do not have a financial filter, unlike anywhere else in the healthcare system. Nobody gets a wallet biopsy before they can schedule an appointment in our clinic. People just come to us. And we often care for people in these before and after moments, these moments where they transitioned from being well to sick, from when their pregnancy went from normal to complicated, from the time that they could walk or talk, or before or after their stroke, before or after their car accident. And it brings to us into their lives in ways that reveal a shared humanity that is present throughout healthcare, but we see it really intimately. And in those moments, it helps us to understand how important the work that we do, how as healers, and I think that's the case throughout healthcare. But then the other thing I wanted to do was to explain to our patients what's happening to them. Why is it that you're young and sick? Why is it that you're waiting 12 hours, that you can't get resources that are necessary? And why is it that we as providers are often trapped right alongside them, unable to fulfill our Hippocratic oath, unable to deliver the services and training that we've been working so hard and so long to deliver, with the recognition that there are no heroes, like we're as much perpetrators as we are victims. And so I wanted to do that in all its humanity and complexity and honesty, and also as an accountability document as I proceed through the next 20 years of work. Be honest about what I'm seeing, not sugarcoat it. Like, even if I can't fix it, let's be honest about what this is. That's what I tried to put in this document.
I think you definitely did. I think you definitely gave a perspective that many of us as physicians, we see, a lot of our patients don't see. When like you just said, you're waiting 12 hours and you don't understand why. And sometimes you're able to give that piece of information at the bedside, but I think your book truly laid it out in ways that many people, even some other physicians who haven't even been to the ER, have seen what we've seen. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Dr. Fisher. I appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Spears as well, and Dr. Renfro, of course, for being here. So I kind of wanted to talk to you about the aspect of your book that deals with the letters to the patients. And I think in the first chapter, you kind of set us up for what that's going to be like. You talk about how you see the patients, or patients are in the kind of like in here to be seen, and you put quotes around the word seen.
Yeah.
And you ask yourself in the book, like, are they being seen by me? Am I seeing them? And I feel like your letters were kind of like a way to do that. My question is, what do you feel like can be done differently, or what are like some of the challenges for when you see a patient and they have been waiting for those 10 hours, but you see them for 3 minutes? And that was in one of your chapters, you kept saying like 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, and they only get that 3 minutes of your time. But there's so much more that goes into the rapport between a physician and a patient. And so I wanted to know your comments on that, what that's like in the ED when things like you mentioned are always flying, and then how can you improve on that aspect of care?
So thank you for asking this question, because it's in many ways why I both dedicated the book to our patients and wrote letters to them, is that, and Dr. Renfro, I'd love to hear your input on this as well. So much of what we're doing is both processing the biopharmacologic interventions that we need to deploy in order to resolve their proximate clinical challenge, see them as fully human and in context, and communicate how all of that comes together as one, right? And we need to do that 30 times in an 8-hour period, maybe 45 times, right? And as the attending, not only do I have to do that, I have there's a whole team working together. There are, 4 or 5 residents that I'm supervising. And so the opportunity to have that level of intimacy that shares a compassionate engagement that recognizes them not just as a disease, but as a person, we fail at that with regularity. And it takes a toll, not only on the patients, but when we become inured to suffering, what does that turn us into? When we put a barrier between ourselves and our patients in these moments when what they need as much as an intervention is compassion, it changes us in ways that require that we have some soul searching around that, particularly as our career progresses. Like at the beginning, we're like, let me just not kill anybody, right? But then there comes a point where you're skilled enough where you're not going to kill anybody, but you're under a lot of time pressure, and you yourself have outside life challenges that sometimes take away from that moment. And what I wanted to do in this book, and in particular in those moments, is to recognize that, look, we're here together. And even when we're not at our best, we're trying. And so what I have taken to is, in many contexts, look, I let patients vent. I sit down and listen, and I apologize, right? I'm not trying to there is literally nothing gained from making it about me or defending these institutions that we are all a part of that are often faceless and unseen. And instead just saying, look, what happened shouldn't have happened. And to the extent that I can prevent it from happening in the future, I will. And then helping to explain, well, what are the contexts in which we all exist? Why is it that a system is structured that forces us, that forces so much healthcare demand in the community that we see the volumes that we see, that restricts the apertures through which patients can enter any of our healthcare systems to such narrow extent that there are these long waits, that restrict the number of resources available? Like, you can't explain all that when people are sick and tired. And oh, in fact, if I spend 30 minutes with you, there's still 40 more people I need to talk to. It's not fair to anybody, right? And we're not going to fix it tonight. And so, people really do want to be seen. They really do want their challenges felt. They really do need to be heard. We really do need to take care of ourselves as physicians and other providers. We really do need to be in those moments fully human in the same way that they are to us, because that's what a relationship is. And you also have to keep in mind that people are here telling us their deepest secrets, right? We're asking them very intimate questions that people don't usually even share with people that are close to them. And so honoring that is sometimes difficult to do every time. That's why I wrote about, people want to be seen. And so let's be deeply engaged in what that fundamentally means, with the recognition that we fail at this regularly, right? I in no way in the book or at any point am saying that I do this right all the time, because it is hard to do right anytime, let alone every time.
Thank you for that. I would completely agree. There, we come in, when I see you in the book as this Black superhero, truly, like you're coming in, you're swooping in, you're saving the South Side of Chicago, and you look at yourself and you're judging yourself, you're timing yourself, you're grading yourself, you're hard on yourself. And at the same time, being able to work with you and know your spirit and how you've impacted so many lives. I know that our patients feel that compassion. And I think that's the key. That's the key to that doctor-patient relationship, is just, hey, I understand. I've been where you've been. And maybe if I haven't, I've seen people who have, and I'm here to listen. And I think your book gives us a lot of that. And I hope many patients get to read this book, because it's such an amazing perspective. You actually helped me segue to a next question. First, a statement. You truly captured the Black experience, the Black struggle, the Black process in your book on how we got here today, not just here as Black people, but Black people in Chicago. You talk about Great Migration, you talk about redlining, you talk about all of this and how this impacts our ability to even be successful just at a humanism way, right? Yeah. There was, in your letter to your patient who got shot, you said this quote that I have to say out loud. You were unlucky not only on the day you were shot, but also on the day you were born.
Mm.
Dr. Fisher. That is so loaded.
So what I tried to do in the book is reveal a version of Blackness that I know and emerge from. It's not the only version, it is a version of Blackness. There's a lot of ways to be fully Black. But I come from people who built this country through labor, through genius, through sacrifice, through blood, through protests, through activism, demanding throughout our history that we live up to our constitutional conversation, right? My people didn't come here by choice. They weren't immigrants. They fled terrorism in the South to come to Chicago, right? To Midwestern towns, and then ultimately came to Chicago. That's a version of Blackness that's very specific and something you see in very commonly on the South Side. And that is a version of Blackness that has been segregated, right, by policy, that has been pinned in, taken those tax resources that have been contributed to our common coffers, had those extracted and sent to other communities. Well, we've had our good services and protections removed that have left our bodies vulnerable, that put us in jobs that don't protect us, that position us in food deserts, that inflow guns. And that is a very specific conversation that my parents had with me, their grandparents had with them. Like, it's a very, very American experience. It's as American as anything else. And so that's what I speak to. In those contexts, like, look, when you look at a map of Chicago, the third most segregated city in the country, you see how we've been concentrated in these communities that are devoid of resources, where the payer mix, for example, Black folks are less likely than white folks to have the appealing health insurance and are 50% more likely to be uninsured. And when you look at a map of Chicago, you see how Black folks have been concentrated in these communities without many healthcare resources. You see how educational attainment, which also comes from these same sources, are also concentrated in these areas of density, low education, low income. And it becomes easy to understand how there is a 30-year life expectancy difference for men in Inglewood compared to the Gold Coast. How low birth weight babies are much more common in Washington Park than they are in Lincoln Park. We too often fall into these traps of talking about, well, is there something biological about that, which assumes that there's something differently biological about any of us, when we actually have the societal markers that fully explain these differences. And so this racial caste system that sorts our goods, services, and protections that ultimately lead to our health, wealth, and education, are things that happened before we're born, right? And any honest conversation about how to ameliorate them means a grand reorganization, not something that will ultimately come from, tinkering around the edges, things that I won't see in my lifetime, right? Things that are intergenerational in their construction and ultimate dismantling. But so was Jim Crow, right? And these were the things that, because my forebears were here working on it, that they were struggling against. And their forebears were struggling against, chattel slavery, right? There's always been this struggle in making an American that kind of sees us as similarly human, absent a racial caste system. The thing is that here on the South Side, you see it very clearly when you're in the emergency department. It is easy to reveal. The other thing about it is we started out with a conversation about Buffalo. Chicago's the third most segregated. Buffalo's the sixth most segregated. The community that this white supremacist targeted and attacked, he did so by looking at the zip code where there are most Black folks. Those folks were pinned in the 1950s and 60s by an expressway that cut through the community and separated them from their services and resources. It was a food desert. That grocery store only came into existence after 10 years of community activism in order to get the community, to get a resource for them. And then they were targeted for slaughter because of these same beliefs. Like, all of these are fruit from the same poison tree. I don't in the book claim that I can fix this, but I do think that we should be honest about what it is and label it clearly. Racial caste is a challenge for all of us, right? And we're either benefiting or suffering from it. And the point is that in many ways we measure it through our wealth, through the Gini index, through our education. But I think the most important is in our health outcomes, and then in the healthcare we receive once we're sick. And so that's why I wrote the passage that I did in the way that I did to the patients that I care for, because, because I descend from this long American group, struggle is a part of what we have. Like, I don't expect to see the solution, but I am willing to tackle it.
Thank you for that. And I just want to, because I'm going to let Isaiah ask his question next, I promise. But I just want to wrap that part up really, because this could be a 12-hour conversation, because you really just hit so many important things, Dr. Fisher. And I just want to say that when we look, I read about your biography, your background with, coming from educators, having parents who are educators, all of your siblings with college degrees, and everybody's educated, right? But in that same wave, you lost a friend to gun violence, and you talked of multiple, right? And you talked about Benji and how that completely shifted the vision of, wow, this very successful #1 player in the country didn't even have a chance. So I know we don't even have to, because that can go a whole nother way, but it was just so beautiful that you showed, this is Black excellence. This is what excellence looks like. And even in that, I am still vulnerable. My cousins are vulnerable, my uncles, my siblings. And so so many of us can relate to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can also relate. And I feel like, although you mentioned, like, of course, you had not mentioned that you can fix the system in the book and all of that. I think it's really inspiring to see what you have done in the book, and how the many different ways you've tried to tackle this system is really, really inspiring. So thank you. For the last question, before we ask you to share excerpt and then open up to the audience, I wanted to ask about your experience as a Black physician. Sure. One of the things that I've heard being in medical school and from my mentors is, the twice as hard to get half as much kind of thing. I not only have to work hard and be the best at work, but I have to be a great partner. I have to be a great mentor. I have to be a great son, sibling, whatever, all of these different things that are expected. And I have to be able to relate the most to my patients because I'm Black identifying, or I'm the one here who's kind of like the patient is a little bit more trustworthy of. And so it kind of like seems like life is pulling you in so many different directions. And I can only suspect that COVID made that worse, or made that more difficult. And so I wanted to ask you your comments on that, or what that's been like during this time, and just in general. Yeah.
It's a good question, because I think that we'll know we have equity when, Black mediocrity is allowed to just exist, and you don't have to be excellent in all things at all times. You can just be you. And so much of what I advise to our Black trainees when they ask me for advice is this literally the same thing I advise to many of the white and other trainees when they ask me for advice, is find what you're passionate about and pursue it with zeal. Like, do you, at the end of the day, that is exactly what you should be allowed to do. And so much of the prevailing conversation, and also being one of few in these largely white spaces where you're expected to do so much, is a setup for failure. You can't do everything, right? You are one person with your own strengths and weaknesses, and the capacity to which you can pursue those honestly and invest yourself with passion will be the extent to which you succeed. And sitting on 5,000 panels doesn't help you with that. Being on every diversity committee doesn't help you with that. Going and giving every talk in every setting doesn't help you with that. Not only doesn't it help you with the focus that's necessary to find your sense of passion and excellence, you also just don't have time in the day. I mean, you need to also recharge. You need to, make mistakes and move forward. You need to think carefully about, the non-work components of your life. And so that's always my advice to literally everybody. And I think that Black folks have not always heard that, or felt confident that they can pursue it, or felt confident that they can pursue that outside the parameters of our traditional institutions that have power and grant access and give status. And in fact, I think that what's unique about our residency program, our medical school, is it attracts such talented and genius folks that, like, y'all can do anything. Like, literally, y'all can do anything, particularly once you recognize that you can and swerve all out of the lanes to find those things that make you feel whole. Because once you're invested in that way, it's like really hard to stop. At the end of the day, life is hard. Like, everything you do won't be successful. But when you're passionate about things, it's much more likely that you'll create the investment that allows for you to overcome the obstacles that will inevitably present themselves as you pursue your goals. So,
okay, yes. So we will transition a little bit now, just to ask you, Dr. Fisher, if you
yes,
would share from your book for those who may not have read it, or just a part of the book that you want to share with us. And
sure.
you.
Okay. So for those who haven't read it, and I don't expect anybody to have read it, it's only been out 8 weeks. The book is alternating chapters between taking people into the clinical setting to help them understand some of the challenges that our patients face in their lives, and understand this intimacy between strangers, and then letters to patients or colleagues about why it is that our system is structured in such a way, either in society or within the healthcare system, that creates the snares that trap so many folks. One person who got trapped was my mom. And without going into too much detail, things worked out fine. She was trapped in ways that I've seen a lot of people trapped, and I've actually presided over folks trapped in those exact same ways. But in the end, I write her a letter about what happened. And I'm going to read 2 paragraphs about that, and I'll try to be quick so that we can have questions. Mom, in 2 decades of caring for people on days they wish never happened and will never forget, I've learned something else. Everything, our ability to create, love, and imagine, is contingent on the health of our bodies. When our bodies inevitably falter, restoring physical abilities falls to my ancient and intimate profession. In those moments when people teeter on that razor's edge of life and death, people often shed their masks of status and ego, revealing that which is most human. On those occasions, some demonstrate a grace and clarity that feels timeless, a connection to something that is in all of us. Then, as doctor and patient, we connect through essential expressions of our humanity, reciprocity, listening, and honesty that sums to a level of trust rarely shared between strangers. And then I touch people right where it hurts, sometimes cutting them open in order to help them. Healthcare connects the most intimate parts of both patients and physicians. And this kind of familiarity means coming to terms with the fact that our bodies are the biological platform on which every other part of life stands. Every single thing we do, individually and collectively. Our healthy bodies allow us to connect to one another and to the infinite. Caring for our bodies and caring for each other is the necessary precondition of life. In other words, health is a human right, the thing we owe one another. In your time in the ED, nobody loved you enough to resolve your suffering. My colleagues apologized for your experience, and I accepted their apologies. I know they couldn't do better. Over the path of my career, I too have struggled to honor this sacred pact in a healthcare system that is deeply unjust and dangerous. Despite high-minded mandates to serve everyone, our establishments find ways to reject, defer, deny, and bankrupt many of those who seek care. In the end, the length of our lives and quality of our existence are silently transferred from poor to rich and from Black to white. These strategies are so embedded that this collection of actors would not perform better if their roles were reversed, and all of a sudden the poor and Black had control of these systems. I can't protect my patients, and when it mattered most, I couldn't turn an organization towards justice when it was on the line. And I couldn't protect you, Mom.
Thank you. So I wanted to shift a little bit. Tracy and I have been texting back and forth, and we're probably going to go to 1 o'clock. If folks are asking questions, we can go past 1. And so we're going to use this time to invite the audience to ask questions, as well as read some of what people have been writing in the chat. But I'm going to be a little bit selfish here and ask a question first, because you know, when we met to talk about what this would be like, one of the things I wanted to sort of focus on was that this is a research bites conversation. Mm-hmm. So what that means for me is I wanted to know about the creation of something like a memoir, the creation of this, right? How do you do that? Like, how do you choose what to write about? How do you choose what to include? How do you pick parts of your life when I'm sure there's a lot you didn't say? And so I wanted to know, how do you go about doing that? And then lastly, how do you negotiate that with a publisher, right? When it tells you this part of your life isn't worth talking about, well, this part is. So how does that happen?
It's a great question. I've been journaling for years to help me both process some of the moral conflict that comes from taking care of patients, and also to better understand what it is that I'm experiencing and seeing. I landed on this structure because I have the best book editor in the business, right? And so much of this is a memoir in that it allows for me to express what I see and to bring people into a very intimate setting. But at the end of the day, this book isn't about me. It's also not about the University of Chicago. It's about the lens that you can use to see America through what happens on the South Side and through the experiences that happen in our medical center that is very common across the entire country. And so much of the selection that was made about what to and not to reveal was a function of its commonalities throughout our society, right? I really wanted the reader to know, as I took their hand and showed them what happens in the hospital and how I learned about how American healthcare is structured, by giving them an understanding of, okay, well, what is my vantage point? What is my lens? Some of that is understanding that the South Side of Chicago is a thing, right? It guided Lorraine Hansberry's pen, right? It launched Obama into the White House. It honed Mahalia Jackson's voice. Like, it's a part of Black America in a way that no other city is. People need to know that, right? To better understand where the patients are coming from, right? This isn't just rando America that, like, all of a sudden came out of nowhere or has only, 30,000 Black folks. Like, it's 1 million Black folks here and have been for a very long time. Like, this is very important. Also, give it enough detail that people can see it, right? Touch it. Chicagoans know this is real. And then, look, I have a publisher and an editor that are very interested in the struggle for justice and being really clear about racial caste. I mean, I have the same editor of Ibram X. Kendi. I have the same editor as Nicole Hannah-Jones. I have the same editor as our own E-Viewing. I have the same editor as Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so much of that is the trust in understanding that this person understands and is not going to try to, be like, you know what, you should say this in order to move units. He's like, no, let's think about this in a way that allows for us to understand America and do it honestly. That sort of was the process. And that meant it took longer than I thought. There were more twists and turns. It was very hard. He also was like, don't make it boring. Like, you have a public health degree. You've worked on policy at all levels. Like, don't make this a wonk shop. Like, if it's to your patients, make it so that they're not feeling like they're taking their medicine, but they're actually understanding it in a way that's speaking to them. So that took a lot of honing, because so many of us are academic writers in our background. That's not what this is. There's a reason people don't read academic writing, right? And so I wanted to make sure that I was able to speak complex issues in meaningful ways.
Thank you. So there are some questions in the chat. I will look through those, but I wanted to just open it up for folks who are in the audience. I see Dr. Dolan, you have your hand up. So can you unsilence yourself, or do I need to?
Yeah, no, I can.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead.
So, excuse me for this very naive question, but I understand coming into the ER, everyone is coming in and they're not coming in on equal footing. But once in the ER, does it matter whether you're white, black, Hispanic, insured, not insured? You know, do all those things matter in terms of care?
I will answer. And I also would love to hear what somebody who hasn't been there for quite as long and see what she sees. There are components when it is the same. When people are in extremis and are at these pivotal moments fighting for their lives, and we are running a code or rushing somebody to a stroke code, where it turns out it's pretty much the same. But beyond that, our ability to get people ancillary tests and follow-up, surgeries as an outpatient, the pace with which they are seen by consultants or get, some of these, not everything is clear cut. People don't, as you know, patients don't read the textbook with their presentations. Could be a heart attack, could be a dissection. I talk in the book a couple of examples of when VIPs actually come to the ER, how heaven and earth is moved to get things done quickly. Things that we often see take 2 hours, 6 hours, happen in 15 minutes. That is very much a part of the tiered healthcare system that exists across America, and one can see at our institution, as you can see it in every institution. Some institutions go so far as to have VIP wings, where despite the fact that so much of our healthcare system is shared resources, Dr. Renfro's training is paid for by the taxpayers. The institution itself sits on land that is subsidized by our taxpayers. The breakthroughs are also taxpayer funded, but one's ability to pay on top of that often opens the aperture of the resources that are available to them in ways that are, in many ways, you can answer for yourself, are they just? But I'd love to see, I've been doing this so long, I'm sort of jaded by it, but Dr. Renfro, who's relatively new, I'd love to, are you seeing something similar?
That and some. So I would say, you hit the nail on the head when comparing, our hospital to some of the hospitals on the north side that we actually train at. You definitely see a night and day difference between wait times, even if everyone was having the same wait times during COVID, when the peaks were the same, by the time you got the scans and the labs and you saw a consult and the disposition was planned, it's light years difference. But I would say even personally, I have seen even in a day-to-day life at one institution where when you have seen the 10th gunshot victim is a young Black male, and then someone sees older white woman who accidentally got shot, and the difference between the response, I've seen it with my own eyes. And that's what is even more alarming to me, is that even in our active training in today's time as new learners and trainees coming in, and I think someone actually asked about bias in the chat, that we are trained to not have bias. Maybe there are some things that happened before us that we say shouldn't be there anymore, but I see it now today. And maybe some may say, well, that's, recognition to seeing the same patient over and over again, but that's not really, we should never be numb to someone being shot. regardless of how they look, right? And it shouldn't change because it's finally a different looking person. And so I would say I even see it in those small subtleties where someone might be laughing about a game in the background when someone's coming in shot versus, oh, wow, this is someone I didn't expect to be shot. And now it's quiet. Everything's working even faster and efficient. So honestly, I see it on both ends. I see it when you're comparing institutions, and sometimes people don't realize the biases that they have right there in real time in front of them.
Thank you for that. Someone in the chat, I believe this is an aspiring student, is asking, and I guess I'll give this question to you, Dr. Fisher, but everyone on the call could probably answer this, which is, what advice would you give an aspiring student in pursuit of a career in medicine? From what you know now, what would you do different earlier in your career?
This is actually a really good question for everybody because we're all in such different points. Earlier in my career, I would have over-indexed on non-work components of my life. I feel like so much of medicine is consuming you, right? It's demanding that you give more to study, more to time. Like there was a long time where I didn't know how to take a vacation, right? Because I trained before there were work hour restrictions. There was never an opportunity to completely unplug, and we were encouraged to find balance, which means get water during your shift, right? Maybe have something to eat. And so if I could have done it over, I would have stepped way back from medicine earlier on and invested more in the people and non-clinical components of my life with the recognition that the medicine will work out.
What about you, Isaiah?
Yeah, I can definitely speak on this. So for the person asking, I'm in medical school, so I know what's to come, but I haven't experienced what's to come in terms of residency and being an attending physician. But of course, I am in the field of medicine, and that is my goal. So definitely have some advice to share on that. I think for me, something that I think I did well was I started my medical career being medical school when I felt mentally, emotionally, physically ready. I didn't come straight from undergrad, although some people feel ready at that point. I think I got a lot of advice in terms of what it's like to pursue a career in medicine. And I took that advice, and through therapy, through whatever it was for me, I was like, okay, I have to wait until I know that I can be the best possible version of Isaiah in medical school when I'm treating patients, when I'm learning what it's going to be like to do that. I would say on the other end, something that I'd change or something that I'd do differently is in a way similar to what Dr. Fisher had mentioned. And I think that's just to expand my knowledge of what is out there outside of medicine. I wanted to be a doctor since pretty young. And so that was kind of like, okay, I'm going to do this eventually. I just have to figure out when that's going to be. But there's so many other aspects of life just to be knowledgeable about that can benefit you in medicine, that can benefit you in your career in medicine. And so to gain some of that knowledge early on could be really beneficial. And I'm learning that now, but I wish I had kind of started that earlier on.
Did you want to answer that too, Dr. Renfro?
You know, I will say medical school was as much for me as a lot of part of life is growing and a lot of learning. And I developed a lot of my grit and resilience in medical school. So I honestly wouldn't change much about it and much of my outlook even, because by the end of it, I had proven to myself that I could do something that I didn't know going into it, or that maybe I kind of falsely came into it thinking that it would be one thing, and I was quickly realized that it was more. But it gave me that passion to drive forward. And then when I finally got to residency, I feel like I am doing exactly what I was placed here to do. And so as I continue to grow and morph as a physician, I keep that in the back of my mind. And when I encourage other medical students, I try to show them that, you know, the path is not always straightforward. The path is not always easy, but if your sincere desire to help others and your compassion and your sense of grace that you were put in this moment to help save lives, if that's at the forefront of your mind, I think eventually the smoke and the noise and all the other things that we can get boggled down on in residency can dwindle when you have that picture at the forefront. And so I try to keep that now, especially that I've been through that, you know, that part, I try to keep that at the forefront of my brain. It allows me to, you know, to get through parts of residency that are tougher.
Thank you. So this is also a question I think that the three of you could also answer. And so there's a theme in the chat, right? And it seems the theme is about bias and implicit bias. And so someone's asking about like, what are ways that you are trained professionally to mitigate bias? I think there's sort of this recognition that everybody has biases, and everybody in particular has biases against Black folks, right? Because of social conditioning. So like, what do you do about that? How do you confront it? How do you confront colleagues if, for instance, you think that's happening? So yeah, that's the general spirit of the questions, a couple of questions I saw in the chat. So we can start with you, Dr. Fisher.
Early on in my career, I did a lot of thinking and work on implicit bias in the clinical setting, with the recognition that people with the same diagnosis get different treatment as a function of, you know, a lot of different things, and one of them being implicit bias. I am now of the opinion that's not one of the more important drivers. In fact, we exist in a system. These are system challenges. We are structured in a way that tiers our healthcare, even within, but also across our healthcare system. And the differences that we face are largely structural. And I worry that by locating the challenge within good or bad individuals alleviates us from these larger system questions that we must confront about the way we've allocated our resources and prioritize the delivery of our protections outside of healthcare, but our services within healthcare. Good people who don't have biases hurt patients regularly because they're working in a dangerous, unjust system that is working exactly as it's designed to do. While I think, which is why I'm also like, well, DEI initiatives are great, implicit training is awesome, but until we create a system that is no longer tiered, that elevates everybody's humanity, that centers morality in its budgeting, in its decision-making processes, that recognizes our shared humanity, none of that will matter. Because you're still fighting against a system that's designed to elevate the rich, that is segregated in its allocation, that is extracting resources from some. And so I don't really know what the training is. I've kind of stepped back from all of those things because I think they're a distraction from reshaping our healthcare system and ultimately our society from the deeper challenges. That said, you should definitely like not be biased, right? Racism's not a good thing when it's deployed in interpersonal interaction. Like, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying of the many drivers, it's not what I perceive to be the most challenging or even salient. I think people don't want to be, I think people who I've worked with and around in general do not want to be racist in the way they interact with folks. They may accidentally do it. They may have implicit bias, but they still work in a system that's designed to hurt people. We've got to fix that.
I would say even the best person is not completely unbiased. I mean, like, they do these bias trainings where they show that if a child burns their hand, the next time they see heat or something similar, they know not to touch it. It's like it's a reaction, it's reactionary. And so I think it's a humanistic thing to have a response, but it's what you do with that next that determines if you are acting on a bias or if you actually process the bias as what it is. Maybe you see a spider, you get scared, but does that mean that, you know, you want to kill the spider or do you want to set it free, right? So like, what initially those reactions, I think we can't control, but like Dr. Fisher said, I don't think it's even the bias itself that is the bigger picture. For me, what I see a lot of great people who all came into medicine, usually for the same reason, which is to help people. But I think somewhere along the way, in the process of a system that is beating you down, a system that's not supporting underserved people the way that you thought that it should be, especially at this day and age, not speaking on any institution, I mean globally, nationally, right? Like in our country, you see this day in and day out, and people start to think about them, in my opinion, start to think about themselves more and not the person. And I think if you allow yourself to think about yourself in this society and your role, and you start to lose that focus, it can beat you down. And by beating you down, but you're going to work to save lives, how are you doing that? How are you actually taking care of yourself and someone else if you don't have that perspective? So I think it day to day, right? Like going through life every day and thinking about the person, one person at a time. Like Dr. Fisher, in your book, even in those 3 minutes, you were still trying to think about every person, trying to give them each an equal opportunity, knowing that your job right there was just to screen them. It wasn't even to be their primary provider, but that passion, that forefoot, that I am here for you, even if only for 3 minutes, and I care about you. I think that's what makes that phenomenal physician, and that's how you get rid of that bias, because you see that person and you see them for who they are, and you're trying to understand them, even if it's for a short period of time. And so I would say, yeah, bias training, that's life training. You know what I mean? Like those who are growing in life and learning to love each other and to care for each other and to be the physician you would want for your parent every day. That's the training. That's what makes the difference. I think when I look at myself now today versus where I was a year ago, I don't care any more or less about people, but I care more about being the better doctor every day for these people. And that I can see how their responses to me were always nice. I'm a happy person, I'm a smiley person, but I've seen the responses even change towards me as people really feel like I am becoming more of a confident doctor for them. So that would be my advice to any trainee and any active doctor who is even maybe 20, 30 years in training. It's never too late to change how you view each patient and your interactions every day.
Thank you.
I'm
going to let you respond, Isaiah. I see that Bo has a question. I think I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'll let Bo, you'll be our last question. And then I'll let Isaiah respond to this. And Isaiah, I also wanted, in the context of this question, to think about also like some of the curriculum changes that have happened in Pritzker, right? Particularly around like thinking about anti-racism, thinking about frameworks to see people more holistically, right? So I wanted to give that context because I know Pritzker has done some work around that in how you answer the question about bias and stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's what I kind of wanted to point out. Being the person that's actually in like medical school right now, Pritzker does a great job with addressing unconscious bias in their curriculum. And of course, I think as they continue to revamp curriculum, they'll always like try to get better and better and better at it. And so there are classes that we take during our first and second year. Again, only a rising third year, so not finished with medical school. But in terms of the preclinical curriculum, we are taught about biases, about treating a patient holistically. However, I think one of the things that I've learned, probably honestly from my parents more than even like medical school, is like somebody can be trained or somebody can take all the classes they want. When I was playing baseball and basketball, like I could in practice learn how to pitch a slider, learn how to do a crossover, whatever it may be. But in the game, I forget, like I'm like, oh shoot. And I go like straight up to a jump shot or like my pitching is off. And it's kind of the same here. Like you can learn about your unconscious bias, about what that's even like, what that means or how to address it. But when you're in the hospital and you're treating a patient, that is like forgotten. And it's like, oh man, like I'm right back in my unconscious bias. And so for me, I think like, especially going into third year, it's going to be a great time where I can not only see like the things that I have to work on, but I can see how the training matches up to actual, in-game stuff. And so I think that that's something to think about is like, even though these trainings are in place, we need people held accountable, people, things pointed out while you're in the moment and doing like treating the patients and that kind of thing. And so although again, Pritzker does a great job with it, I think for healthcare, something like healthcare, it's so important because you're having patients' lives in your hands. And so being able to address those things in the moment is super important as well.
Thank you. So, Bo, we will go to you for our last question. Can you unsilence yourself and talk to us?
Yeah, fantastic. I come from a somewhat different angle. I was born in 1956 in Houston Negro Hospital. So I was born in the Jim Crow South, but not raised there. And I'm 65 years old and an MBA from Chicago Booth in the graduate program in health administration and policy. And what I really want to ask all of you, but specifically Dr. Fisher, because you're raising this issue of unconscious bias, and where does it fit in the tier of issues that need to be addressed? From my point of view, it's very easy to see 4 levels of racism: the institutionalized, the structural, the individually mediated, and the internalized. And from my point of view, we have to address all of them, but particularly for physicians and emergency department physicians. I ran the ED at Roseland, because you have, it's very similar to cops, you have the power of life and death in your hands. And as Dr. Selkridge was just saying, it's in the moment when things happen. It's not just in your preparation and so forth. It seems to me that finding structural ways to address unconscious bias by clinicians, and actually one of our ideas, as with my colleague Augustus White, is to work on how do we train patients to avoid unconscious bias as well. And the paper we're working on right now is what you're talking about, is how do we help organizations not only support through training and so on, but what can we do as organizations? As a former healthcare exec, I know there were times that my patients were getting treated unfairly, unequal treatment because of unconscious bias. I didn't have any tools to deal with it. So, but it seems to me that the individual patient-clinician relationship and unconscious bias there is still one important piece. Just want to hear your response to where it fits.
So the unconscious bias research makes clear that we all use these shortcuts in order to save energy and get to conclusions quickly.
Yes.
In most settings, they get deployed when we don't have enough time to get enough sufficient information to base our decisions on the individuals or the context that's in front of us. And so, like Dr. Selkridge mentioned, you're under pressure, you go right back to what you already know, as opposed to using these new tools. What that speaks to me is we need to shape a system that allows for people to be their best selves, right? I am very, as I mentioned earlier, skeptical of the capacity of unconscious bias training to make meaningful impacts if we have not even created a system that allows for them to use their learnings. If people are working 3 minutes at a time, if they're forced to prioritize profit over people, if VIPs have secondary end-arounds, all the training in the world can't overcome a system that is designed to harm the poor, and in Chicago, that means the Black. And so, look, I'm not against people interrogating their priors. I think it's important. I am not against people being very thoughtful about what they're bringing into the clinical setting. I just don't think they can overcome a system that's designed to exploit. Furthermore, these systems that are designed to exploit are within democratic control. We don't have to try to change hearts and minds of individuals except as it pertains to their capacity to vote, to shape the way we've created a system. These are tangible outcomes that we can shift if we as a society decide that we are all similarly human, that we do deserve more than what we're giving to one another right now. Like, there's a component of this that's just a fight, right? At each point in history, we've had these abominable differences. And at each point we go back and say, well, that slavery thing, people just didn't know. They knew it was terrible. There were massive fights at the time. They just didn't win on the side of justice. Oh, Jim Crow was terrible. They just didn't know what we know now. They knew. There were fights going on. They just did not win. Similarly, 1 million people have died from COVID. It's not that people don't know. It's not that, I'm not alone in recognizing that we have a tiered system that's harming people. We know. It's just a fight. Are we going to win is the question. And I think that is winning in shaping a system that is more just, as opposed to hoping that individuals in their moment don't express the bias that have been taught to them over the course of their lifetime, which is not to say I don't think it's important. I just don't think that's the main battlefield.
Can I just respond very quickly? For me, I look at it similarly to cops, okay? Do I want to change the criminal justice system? Of course I do. And if I had to say choose between one or the other, I agree with you. I'd focus on the system side. But if I want to prevent more George Floyds, part of the way of doing that is not just training. Can't be just training. It has to be, how do I structure the way people behave, the responses to the behavior, and giving clinicians just like you guys the opportunity to say, okay, how do I do something different? Here's one way. I give my patient a teach back, or I have my patient tell me they need a teach back, because when I'm going back and forth, it's easier for me to see them as a whole human being and respond to them as a whole human being. Doesn't take away the 3-minute issue, but I think it does, and we need to evaluate whether it really does make a difference. But I think it makes a difference in a way that training doesn't, and I still do training. That's it.
Thank you. Yes, so I will turn it over to Dr. Matthews, who wants to thank everyone for being here today.
I sure do. I really first want to thank the panelists for an engaging and important conversation. This was so meaningful. And I want to also thank Dr. Spears for curating this panel and selecting our interlocutors for Dr. Fisher. Thank you all in the audience for coming. We hope if you can take a few minutes to fill out our poll to help us do better programming. And also remind people that they can purchase a copy of Dr. Fisher's book at the Seminary Co-op Bookstore, which is a frequent partner with us in presenting conversations like this. So thanks again for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day, and happy Friday.